called the Trilateral Commission. The first meeting of the Trilateral Commission was held on July the 23rd and 24th of 1972. A good source of information on the Trilateral Commission is this book, published by the Freeman Institute of Salt Lake City, simply called the Trilateral Commission. And there on the cover we see a picture of David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now this is a good source because what it does, it actually interviews the people, members of the Trilateral Commission, and you can read what they say themselves through actual interviews. What is the purpose of the Trilateral Commission? One who has discovered what their purpose is Senator Barry Goldwater. Senator Goldwater put his writings into a book entitled With No Apologies. And there it is, With No Apologies, published by Barry, written by United States Senator Barry M. Goldwater. Goldwater is not a member of the Trilateral Commission. Senator Goldwater said this, number 4, what the Trilaterals truly intend is the creation of a worldwide economic power superior to the political governments of the nation-states involved. As managers and creators of the system, they, the Trilaterals, will rule the future. Senator Goldwater went on to say, number 5, it is intended to be the vehicle for multinational consolidation of the commercial and banking interest by, notice what he said, Senator Goldwater says, they are going to seize control of the political governments of the United States. He continued, number 6, in my view, the Trilateral Commission represents a skillful, coordinated effort to seize control and consolidate the 4 centers of power, political, monetary, intellectual, and ecclesiastical, meaning every aspect of our life. Someone else figured this out. Columnist Jeremiah Novak wrote this, number 7. The Trilateral Commission's most immediate concern is the creation of a new world monetary system to replace gold and the dollar as the international exchange units with a new currency. Now, we've examined some of that in the past, that new currency. You might recall in a previous lecture, we showed you pictures of the new money that's coming out all over the world. And on the left-hand side, there's a blank space. Maybe someone is telling us something. If Mr. Novak is right, someday the world will have a common money. Perhaps the first step towards this one world currency was taken in 1978 when 6 European countries created a new European monetary system. Excuse me. They created a system to stabilize their currencies in relation to each other. But let's get back to the little-known governor from Georgia. How did Mr. Carter become President of the United States? In the fall of 1973, Jimmy Carter had dinner with David Rockefeller in London, England. Why was Jimmy Carter in London having dinner with David Rockefeller? There are only 2 possibilities. Number 8, Carter discovered David Rockefeller. Or, number 9, Rockefeller discovered Carter. We're going to examine those 2 possibilities, and we're also going to say that the third possibility, that these 2 important men met in London by chance, is too impossible to consider. Let's take them one by one. Let's examine the first possibility first. Number 10, that Carter went to London because he wanted to be president and believed that Mr. Rockefeller could do that. That's number 1. Why would Carter believe that David Rockefeller would have that power? I'd like to give you 4 examples as to why Carter could feel that Rockefeller had the power to make him, Carter, President of the United States. In January of 1974, David Rockefeller met with Pope Paul VI. Now, it's interesting that David is not a Catholic and didn't publicly convert after their meeting. Why did David Rockefeller see the Pope? It is known that 2 weeks later, after that meeting, in February of 1974, Cardinal Minzeni of Hungary was ordered to the Vatican and told to no longer speak out against the communist government in Hungary. Cardinal Manzini was probably the most vocal anti-communist in that area. He was the primate of Hungary for about 30 years. Cardinal Manzini spoke out repeatedly against the communists and also the Nazis during World War II. We are led to believe that these two events, the meeting of Rockefeller and the Pope and the removal of the cardinal, are not connected. However, I believe that these events are connected and that David Rockefeller had the power to ask the Pope to remove a cardinal when he wanted the cardinal out of Hungary. Why did Rockefeller want the cardinal out of Hungary? I'll try to answer that question a little later, but now let's just examine the possibility that Rockefeller has that kind of power. There is a real important reason why he wanted him out, and we'll cover that in a minute. The second example of Rockefeller's power occurred in July of 1964. Mr. Rockefeller went to Moscow and closeted himself with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, the dictator of Russia, for 2.5 hours. We have been told for years that the communists and the capitalists are bitter enemies. Yet, Mr. Khrushchev did not have Mr. Rockefeller arrested as a traitor to the people, as an exploiter of the masses, as a tyrant that we've been lied to or been told about. They met privately for 2.5 hours. In October of 1964, just 3 months later, Nikita Khrushchev resigned for no apparent reason. Nikita Khrushchev was a dictator. No one tells Khrushchev what to do. Yet I believe that the chairman of the board, David Rockefeller, fired the branch manager, Nikita Khrushchev. I will show you later in this series that Russia is controlled by American and European bankers and industrialists. You might recall from a previous class that non-Russian bankers had hired Nikolai Lenin to run the communist Russian Revolution, and that their control of that government continues even today. We'll discuss that later, as I've said, to show you that the Western countries have physically constructed the economy and military power of Russia. So it is quite conceivable that Mr. Rockefeller, representing the real power in Russia, could actually fire the so-called dictator of Russia. According to this little book called The Rockefeller File by Gary Allen, it was written by him a few years ago. The Rockefeller File says that David Rockefeller met with 27 heads of state in 1973, including the rulers of Russia and Red China. Let me repeat that. David Rockefeller met with 27 heads of state in 1973, including the rulers of communist Russia and Red China. 1973, that was the very year that Jimmy Carter met him, David Rockefeller, in London, England. And I'd like to remind you about his visits with heads of state. Nobody has elected David Rockefeller to anything. Why would heads of state want to meet with him about anything unless they realize that David Rockefeller was a man of extraordinary power? Let me give you just one more example of David Rockefeller's power. Malcolm Fraser was the Australian Prime Minister in 1976. He came to America in July of that year to meet with President Gerald Ford. The day before Prime Minister Fraser met with President Ford, he met with David Rockefeller. Isn't that interesting? Why? So, with all of this evidence of Mr. Rockefeller's power with heads of state, it is quite conceivable that Jimmy Carter figured it out and went to this man with all of this power to ask him to make him, Jimmy Carter, President of the United States. By the way, let me say it over again. By the way, while we're talking about dinners with David Rockefeller, let's look at this picture taken in September of 1980. It shows presidential candidate Ronald Reagan at a table eating dinner with David Rockefeller. Isn't that interesting? Let's examine the second possibility that David Rockefeller discovered Jimmy Carter and wanted to meet him. It was just the reverse. Rockefeller wanted to talk to Carter. The Trial Commission was the idea of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who approached David Rockefeller with his concept. Mr. Brzezinski later became its executive director. Mr. Brzezinski, according to the Don Bell report of February the 22nd, 1980, had spelled out in 1973 what sort of man would win the presidency in 1976. Brzezinski said, number 11, the Democratic candidate in 1976 will have to emphasize work, the family, religion, and increasingly patriotism. On March the 21st, 1978, the New York Times published an article about Zbigniew Brzezinski. The article read in part number 12. Mr. Brzezinski, executive director of the Trial Commission, had the foresight to ask the then obscure former governor of Georgia to join its distinguished ranks. Their initial teacher-student relationship blossomed during the campaign. Notice that it was Mr. Brzezinski who asked Jimmy Carter to join the Trial Commission when the governor was still obscure. That had to be prior to his appearance on What's My Line in December of 1973. Also notice that Mr. Brzezinski became Mr. Carter's teacher during the campaign of 1976. Mr. Carter confirmed this in a Washington Post article in December of 1981. Mr. Carter described Mr. Brzezinski as, quote, number 13, his, meaning Carter's, key advisor for me, while I have been, meaning I, Carter, have been an eager student in what amounted to a private tutorial course, meaning Mr. Brzezinski is tutoring me. Jimmy Carter wrote another book called Why Not the Best? And there's the book, little paperback. This came out in about 1976. There's Jimmy Carter with the smile. Why Not the Best by Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter further amplified his thoughts about the commission. He wrote this on page 146, number 14. Membership on this commission has provided me with a splendid learning opportunity, and many of the members have helped me in my study of foreign affairs. Now, just what is it that Mr. Brzezinski taught Jimmy Carter? What does the teacher believe in? Mr. Brzezinski wrote this in October 1965, number 15. Mr. Brzezinski said, we've already read this quote a little while ago, or last week rather, I believe it was, I should like to address myself to the problems of political change. I think we accept the idea of a vast expansion in social regulation. It may take such forms as legislation for the number of children, perhaps even legislation determining the sex of children once we have choice, the regulation of weather, the regulation of leisure, and so forth. That's what he wants, the expansion of social regulation. The New World Order is going to expand in social regulation, isn't it, as we've already seen. The New York Times Magazine in May of 1976 wrote about these two individuals, number 16. Zbigniew was the first guy to pay attention to Carter, talk to him, and notice this, please pay attention, sent him, Carter, his, Brzezinski's, books and articles. Notice, Brzezinski sent Carter his books. We're going to examine that in a minute. For the better part of 3 years, Brzezinski, along with Professor Richard Gardner, by the way, a member of both the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trial Commission, and had Carter virtually to himself. Jimmy Carter said that his teacher, Zbigniew Brzezinski, sent him his books for him to read. So if we can read Brzezinski's writings, we can read what Carter read. Brzezinski wrote this book, probably of many. This little book is called Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Tectonic Era. And down here at the bottom, you see it was written by Zbigniew Brzezinski. This book was written in 1970, 3 years prior to Mr. Carter becoming involved with Zbigniew Brzezinski. We can read what Carter could have read. On page 72 of this book, entitled Between Two Ages, Mr. Brzezinski wrote this, number 17. Marxism represents a further vital and creative stage in the maturing of man's universal vision. Marxism is simultaneously a victory of the external active man over the inner passive man, and a victory of reason over belief. On page 73 of Between Two Ages, Mr. Brzezinski wrote this, number 18. Marxism has served as a mechanism of human progress, even if its practice has often fallen short of its ideals. Teilhard de Chardin, by the way, is a Jesuit theologian, notes at one point that, quote, monstrous as it is not modern totalitarianism really the distortion of something magnificent, and thus quite near to the truth, unquote. On page 83 of Between Two Ages, Mr. Brzezinski wrote this, number 19. Marxism, disseminated on the popular level in the form of communism, represented a major advance in man's ability to conceptualize his relationship to his world. On page 123, Mr. Brzezinski wrote this in Between Two Ages, number 20. Marxism provided a unique intellectual tool for understanding and harnessing the fundamental forces of our time. What is Marxism? Now, we covered that subject a few weeks ago, but as a reminder, let me quote a few of Marx's thoughts. This is what Marxism is according to the author, Karl Marx. Marx wrote, number 21, the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of man is a demand for their real happiness. Number 22, Marx wrote, you are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. That is just what we intend. Number 23, Marx wrote, the communists openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. That is Marxism. That is from the man who wrote it, Karl Marx. Brzezinski called Marxism, number 24, a victory, a creative stage, human progress, a major advance, a unique tool. I call Marxism a hoax, a fraud, and a scam. And Marxism is the most evil and diabolic philosophy to ever be thought of by man. Marxism has murdered millions of innocent people all over the world, and Brzezinski calls that a victory. And Brzezinski was the teacher of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter received the 1976 Democratic presidential nomination, and we were told that he hadn't made up his mind about a vice presidential candidate. He told the nation he would make his choice from among 7 men. Those men were Senators John Glenn, Edward Muskie, Henry Jackson, Frank Church, Walter Mondale, and Adlai Stevenson III. And lastly, the 7th man was Congressman Peter Edino. Jimmy Carter says, I will pick my vice presidential candidate from amongst those 7 men. As far as I could determine, and at that time, only one of those 7 men, Walter Mondale, was a fellow member of the Trial Commission that Jimmy Carter had joined. As soon as I heard his list of 7 men, and after I was able to check the Trial Commission membership list, I predicted that Jimmy Carter would appoint Walter Mondale, and Carter did. Carter picked his fellow member of the Trial Commission as his vice presidential candidate. Carter went on to name 5 Trial Commission members to his 12-man cabinet, and he named 19 members as his top 19 advisors. All 19 were members of the Trial Commission. During the 1980 presidential campaign, candidate Ronald Reagan was asked about whether he would, like Jimmy Carter, fill his cabinet with members of the Trial Commission. Reagan answered this, number 25. I don't think that any administration of the U.S. government should have filled its top 19 positions, its top 19 positions filled by people from any one group or organization representing one viewpoint. No, I would go in a different direction. But after his election, President Ronald Reagan began appointing some 90 Council on Foreign Relations and or Trilateral Commission members to his cabinet, the National Security Advisor, and as his key advisors, 90 of them. All in all, Reagan has appointed or retained a total of 257 individuals with CFR or commission membership in their resumes. Senator Barry Goldwater has been critical of the Trial Commission as well as its sister organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. As we read a few moments ago in his book, With No Apologies, Goldwater said this about the Trial Commission, number 26. What the Trilaterals truly intend is the creation of a worldwide economic power. They will rule the future. He said that we are going to get, that they, meaning the Trial Commission, we're going to, number 27, seize control of the political government of the United States. Notice, they're not going to ask us, they're going to seize control, according to Senator Barry Goldwater. He said this about the Council on Foreign Relations, number 28. The CFR believes national boundaries should be obliterated and one world rule established. Number 29. The CFR vision, according to Barry Goldwater, of the future would be accompanied by a loss in personal freedom of choice and the reestablishment of the restraints which provoked the American Revolution. Others didn't trust the CFR and the Trial Commission as well. In 1980, the nationwide American Legion met in Boston, Massachusetts in their annual convention. They passed a resolution that demanded, notice, they didn't ask, they demanded an investigation into these two organizations. The resolution read in part, number 30. Resolved by the American Legion that we demand that the Congress of the United States launch a comprehensive investigation into the Trial Commission and its parent organization, the Council on Foreign Relations, to determine what influence has been and is being exerted over the foreign and domestic policies of the United States. But nothing was done. So, the American Legion passed a similar resolution at their annual convention in 1981. As far as I know, nothing has been done. There was no investigation. Others distrust the commission as well. In 1984, President Reagan invited the entire 200 members of the commission to the White House, and conservatives were not pleased. Senator Goldwater further amplified his concerns about this nation at the 1980 Republican Convention. He said that there were forces at work in the United States and expressed doubts that there would be similar conventions in 1984. He said, this, number 31, this might be the last Republican convention, and in 2 weeks, the last Democratic convention. There are forces working against our country. About 5 minutes after that speech, as I remember, CBS newscaster Dan Rather was on the floor of the convention interviewing the senator. Mr. Rather, for some strange reason, failed to ask the senator what he meant by his rather startling comments. Isn't that interesting? Mr. Rather later joined the Council on Foreign Relations. It is presumed that when a person joins an organization, he freely acknowledges his support of that organization's goals, programs, and purposes. Current Vice President George Bush was, until recently, a member of both the Trial Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations. George Bush was even a director of the Council. The reason he left both organizations was because he had to when he became the Vice President of the United States. President Carter also resigned from the Trial Commission when he became the President. They did so because Commission members must resign their membership upon entering an elected position inside the executive branch of the national government. When Bush left, he made no apparent repudiation of the goals of these two organizations. In other words, he had to leave because he became vice president. He didn't leave because he disagreed with their purposes. I believe it is fair to say that he must still support what these two organizations stand for. Remember that George Bush was also a member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society, another organization dedicated to bringing about the New World Order. Yet, with all of these criticisms of the Trilateral Commission and the CFR, Senator Barry Goldwater supports George Bush for the presidency of the United States. Barry Goldwater became the honorary chairman for a luncheon for George Bush's presidential campaign here in Tucson in 1987. Now, this is the invitation that I received in June of that year, inviting me to attend the luncheon. Now, I don't have $1,000, and I'm only a registered Republican, but I got the invitation. On the top, you'll see that the senator was the honorary chairman for that luncheon. And the senator from Arizona went to New Hampshire during the Republican primary in February of 1988 to endorse Vice President George Bush, and here's a picture of that meeting. Now, why should the senator support the vice president? Bush is certainly no conservative. We can examine Mr. Bush's voting record while he was a congressman from Texas between 1967 and 1971. George Bush only voted conservative 27% of the time. That means he voted liberal 73% of the time. It is not his conservatism that draws the senator, Barry Goldwater, to George Bush, is it? As we've seen, the senator has attempted to warn us about the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Surely, Mr. Goldwater knows that the vice president was a member of both organizations. The only thing that makes sense is that the senator knows there is a conspiracy and that he supports it by supporting George Bush, one of its most visible supporters. It is the only thing that makes sense. Why would the senator make such incriminating statements about the CFR and the Trilateral Commission and then support the most visible supporter of those organizations, unless he, Senator Goldwater, too, supported their goals? As I said, it is the only thing that makes sense. The next thing I'd like to discuss is some of the actions that President Carter and his administration took during his 4 years as president. But before we do, I'd like to explain the basic strategy of this conspiracy by going to the blackboard. Let me erase this and start over again and draw my famous drawing of the population. I've done this before in this series. You've seen that drawing of the Volkswagen Beetle before. But here's the condition of these governments that we're going to discuss. We saw this, by the way, in the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. We saw it in Cuba. Prior to the revolution, there's a group at the top, the very wealthy, who run the government. There's a poor class in the bottom, and this class is declining, and there's a growing middle class. In every one of the revolutions we covered before, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and the Cuban Revolution, this was exactly what was happening. Every country was developing a middle class. It was increasing, and the poor were decreasing. But as they grew, they were starting to get into the wealthy class. So there was a Russian Revolution in China, in Russia, and in Cuba. And after the revolution was over, there were two classes again, weren't there? There was no middle class, and there was an increasing poor class at the bottom. This is the purpose of communism, to abolish the middle class. In Cuba, in China, and in Russia, in all three cases, prior to the Communist Revolution, there was a growing middle class until communism came to abolish the middle class. Please remember that in the next few examples we're going to discuss about what Jimmy Carter did as President of the United States. We're going to see that as we examine some of the events of the past. The first example I'd like to bring to your attention is what happened in Iran in the late 1970s. Iran was led by the Shah of Iran, and his nation was a major source of the world's oil, supplying between 70 to 90% of the oil imported by Western Europe, Japan, Israel, South Africa, and Rhodesia. The Shah realized that when the oil ran out, his nation would return to poverty. So the Shah of Iran started a plan to develop a middle class which would be able to survive the passing of the oil supply. Let's look at that, number one. Under the direction of the Shah, Iran had been transformed in a single generation from a near-feudal agricultural society to an urbanized, burgeoning, industrialized, and modern country. His plan was to make Iran a technologically advanced, economically diversified, and self-sustaining nation, so that in the next century, when the oil ran low, Iran would not go into an economic decline. The Shah had written into law in Iran the principles of religious toleration, separation of church and state, and expanded legal and political rights for women. He set up an advisory parliament to which, over the years, additional powers were to be granted. He created a land reform program in which large estates were broken up and given to landless tenants. In other words, the Shah of Iran was developing a middle class. Something's got to happen. The Shah of Iran wrote a book entitled An Answer to History. The Shah wrote number 2, The Americans Wanted Me Out. Certainly, this is what the human rights champions in the State Department wanted. You might remember that in the early, President Carter's campaign in the early 70s, he said, our government, in the late 70s rather, our government is going to champion the human rights around the world. We're going to intercede and interfere. We're going to affect nations that are violating human rights. So we're going to see now that they interrupted and violated the Shah of Iran and Iran. The Shah charged that the U.S. Air Force General Robert E. Heiser came to Tehran, Iran, to work with a traitor Iranian officer to pave the way for Ayatollah Khomeini's takeover of Iran in 1979. General Heiser was deputy commander of the U.S. forces in Europe. Someone who supported that position was General Alexander Haig, the chief of NATO at the time. Syndicated columnists Evans and Novak, in one of their columns in 1980, said that the main reason that Haig resigned as NATO chief was because his deputy, Air Force Major General Robert Heiser, was sent to Iran under orders from the Carter administration to encourage the overthrow of the Shah. After the takeover, one senior Iranian diplomat in Washington was quoted as saying, number 3, President Carter betrayed the Shah and had helped create the vacuum that will soon be filled with Soviet-trained agents and religious fanatics who hate America. Now, why did the Shah have to leave Iran? Why was he removed from office? He tried to answer that question in his book, number 4. The Shah argued in his memoirs that, listen to this, the great multinational oil companies had been subverting his rule because of his insistence that Iran get a greater share of the oil revenues. Notice what the Shah said. He did not control Iran's oil. We have been told that these Arabian countries control their own oil resources, but the Shah said that he was in partnership with the multinational oil companies and that he was the junior partner. He didn't control the oil. He said that he tried to get a larger share of Iran's oil revenues for his country. He didn't control the supply of oil in Iran. Now, let's examine who did control Iran's oil. Who are the multinational oil companies that did control Iran's oil? One book that tried to answer that question was this one, called The Seven Sisters, written by Anthony Sampson. This book was published in 1975. Mr. Sampson said that an agreement was reached in August of 1954 between the Shah and the 7 major oil companies of the world. Here's how those 7 divided Iran's oil supply, number 5. British Petroleum was to get 40%. Shell Oil would get 14%. Exxon, Gulf, Texaco, Mobil, and Chevron, or Southern California, or SoCal, I guess it's called, would all get 8%. And the CFP, those are the initials for the French Compagnie Française de Pétrole, would get 6%. The book further discussed the connection between the East and the West. It told us on page 243 where the oil companies get their capital from, number 6. The Morgan Guarantee Bank provided underwriting for most of the sisters, while the Chase Manhattan and the First National City provided much of their international services. Did you hear what he just said? Chase Manhattan Bank and the Morgan Bank financed the Seven Sisters, and they controlled Iran's oil. This will be a good place to break this tonight. We're going to now start to study next week, or continue our study of this process, who controls Iran's oil. I invite you to tune in again next week as we continue to explore the secrets of history. Thank you so very, very much.
View of history. It is the contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I'm the host of this series. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I have been studying the historical view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I published my book entitled The Unseen Hand, and I've subtitled An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. Tonight's session is number 18 in our series, and we're going to continue our discussion of Iran and then a couple of other nations that have gone from the free enterprise system to either socialism or communism. We're going to continue our discussion on that tonight, but we'll first start on our study of Iran. Last week we discussed the fact that it's my contention that Jimmy Carter, as President of the United States, wanted Iran to be changed from power from the Shah of Iran to the Ayatollah. In other words, Jimmy Carter intentionally turned that country over from the Shah of Iran to the Ayatollah. We're going to pick up that story at this point, and then we'll continue to discuss that. I'd like to ask all of you a question that you'll have to answer on your own. Let's presume that I'm right and that David Rockefeller made Jimmy Carter President of the United States. And then let's presume that the Shah is right, that President Carter wanted him, meaning the Shah, to leave Iran. And then let's presume that Carter would be grateful to the man who made him president. And then let's presume that Chase Manhattan Bank has loaned money to the oil companies in Iran. And then let's presume that the Chase Manhattan Bank would not want the Shah out of power if the transfer of power to the Ayatollah would harm their loans to the oil companies in Iran. Is there anyone naive enough to believe that Carter would be his own man and to decide foreign policy by himself? I don't believe that he would. In other words, Carter would not have acted against the best interests of the oil companies in Iran. That means that the Seven Sisters and their bankers wanted the Shah of Iran to leave that nation. And they wanted the Ayatollah to come to power in Iran. The Ayatollah took over on February the 11th, 1979, and quickly started a reign of terror. According to this article that appeared in the March 1982 Reader's Digest, number 7, the Ayatollah has succeeded in institutionalizing fear and recrimination. Number 8, firing squads in the Evin prison have been known to execute as many as 80 prisoners a night to fulfill the abrupt sentences of the Islamic revolutionary courts that have held sway since Khomeini came to power in February 1979. In 3 years, the Ayatollah killed over 4,000 Iranians. For what crimes? The article said for such crimes as, quote, drug offenses, or corruption on earth, unquote, and, quote, being an enemy of God, unquote. Former Prime Minister Mehdi, I'm going to pronounce this the best I can, Mehdi Bazargan, said this about the Ayatollah's regime, number 9. Acts of revenge by this government will turn the country into an ocean of blood. Jimmy Carter said this about the new government of the Ayatollah on February the 27th, 1979, about 2 weeks after the Ayatollah took over. Number 10. The Khomeini government has made it clear that ever since it came to power that they desire a close, working, and friendly relationship with the United States. Isn't that interesting? But there is a far more interesting twist to the story of the Ayatollah. There are some who believe that the Ayatollah who took over in 1979 was not the same Ayatollah who was exiled by the Shah 14 years earlier in 1965. Yet the one who left was supposedly the one who returned. Some who knew both the earlier Ayatollah and the one who came to Iran in 1979 say that the first Ayatollah had 9 fingers and that the second had 10 fingers. One who knew both was former Iranian Premier Amir Hoveyda. He testified thusly in Iran, number 11. I knew him, meaning the first Ayatollah, and I can assure you he had only 9 fingers. This Khomeini, the second Khomeini, is an impostor, Hoveyda said. At the end of his testimony, Hoveyda was taken outside the room and shot. You don't want to talk about the missing finger. This story was briefly covered in a newspaper in England called the Daily Express on May the 14th, 1979. It showed a picture of the second Khomeini with one of his fingers missing and asked this question, is this how he should look? And there you saw a picture of what this Ayatollah should look like with only 9 fingers. There is an obvious answer to the missing finger, by the way. It is simply that the finger evolved while the Ayatollah was in exile. And while he was gone in 14 years, the finger grew back in place. But whoever the Ayatollah is, he is definitely running Iran. Former chief of the Polish KGB, Colonel Michael Goleniewski, testified that the Soviet KGB had infiltrated the Shiite Muslim sect as early as the 1950s, and that the Ayatollah was a Soviet agent. There's one more thing I should bring to your attention. Number 12. Before he left office, the Shah was induced to invest his funds, and by the way, those funds have been estimated as much, in a range rather, from $1/2 billion to $25 billion with Chase Manhattan Bank. The Shah of Iran placed billions of dollars with the Chase Manhattan Bank. Just as the Tsar of Russia was induced to place millions of his dollars in Western banks, so was the Shah. Isn't that interesting? Next, I'd like to discuss the Panama Canal. On September the 7th, 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed a treaty with Panama relinquishing control of the Panama Canal to the government of Panama. During the televised debates in 1976 between President Gerald Ford and candidate Jimmy Carter, Mr. Carter explained this, number 13. Carter said, I would never, and notice the word never, I would never give up complete or practical control of the Panama Canal Zone, but I would continue to negotiate with the Panamanians. I would not relinquish the practical control of the Panama Canal Zone anytime in the foreseeable future. The treaty was signed by the leader of the Panamanian government, Omar Torrijos, shown here with President Jimmy Carter. Mr. Torrijos had an interesting background. He became the leader of Panama in 1968 when, with the assistance of the Panamanian National Guard, he overthrew the government of the duly elected president, Dr. Arnulfo Arias. Professor Winston Robles, a director of the Panamanian Committee for Human Rights, charged in an open letter to President Jimmy Carter that the State Department of the United States was misleading national public opinion by covering up the continuing human rights violations of the Torrijos dictatorship. Dr. Robles said that the Torrijos government had murdered hundreds, forcibly exiled more, and jailed and tortured thousands. Dr. Robles pointed out, number 14, that United States financial and military assistance is responsible for keeping Torrijos in power, unquote. And Jimmy Carter was the champion of human rights. That's what we were told. The Communist Party was the only legal party functioning in Panama, and the Torrijos government was heavily infiltrated with communists. American columnist Drew Pearson had identified Torrijos as a member of the Communist Party of Panama as far back as November the 19th, 1968. But Carter signed the treaty with the Marxist Torrijos. Why did he do so? Maybe we can figure that out and answer that question. When Torrijos came to power, number 15, Panama's national debt was $160 million. In 1978, it was $1,400 million, or $1.4 billion. The national debt had gone up by nearly 10 times in just a few years. Isn't that interesting? These loans were made by these banks, amongst others. Number 16. These are the banks that loaned money to the Marxist Torrijos and kept him in power. Chase Manhattan Bank, First National City Bank, Bank of America, and the Marine Midland Bank. Number 17. The Panamanian debt to the American bankers was so large that Panama had to allocate some $47 million, 39% of its national budget, to pay the interest, just the interest on those loans. Of the 30 or so banks that had made rather shaky loans, one half of them had at least one Trilateral Commission member on the board of directors. In other words, the Trilateral Commission wanted these banks and approved the loan of this money to the the Marxist Torrijos. The American who negotiated the treaty was Saul Linowitz, a director for the Marine Midland Bank of New York, which had loaned nearly $8 million to Panama. At the time that the Senate voted to approve the treaty, there were 16 senators who were either members or would later become members of the Council on Foreign Relations. 15 of those senators voted in favor of the treaty. It seems fair to conclude that the CFR wanted America to get rid of the Panama Canal. Isn't that interesting? So the government of Panama was having trouble paying its interest payments to the bankers. But the Panamanian government had a major fundraising instrument, the canal itself, to pay the bankers what was owed them, so we transferred control of the canal to the communist government. Mr. Linowitz resigned that directorship a month after joining the negotiating team, quote, to avoid even the suggestion of a conflict of interest, unquote. Notice he resigned after he joined the negotiating team, and he was still one of the bankers who had loaned money to the Panamanian government. Another country betrayed by the Carter administration was Nicaragua. Nicaragua was being led by Anastasio Somoza. Mr. Somoza had been, and notice the word, elected. Somoza had been elected to the presidency of his country the last time on December the 1st, 1974. Notice I said that Somoza was elected. Out of a population of 2,250,000 people, over 1 million registered to vote, and 850,000 of those people voted in the election. 750,000 for Somoza and only 100,000 for his opponent. The Organization of American States monitored the 1974 elections and found no, and I repeat, no voting irregularities. In other words, President Somoza was honestly elected, and by a vote of approximately 9-1. President Somoza said this about his administration, number 18. Nicaraguans were free to work where they chose. Education was free. They were free to travel about. We had freedom of the press. We were building roads. Our country was, and notice this, our country was financially sound. Education was free. The people had the right of collective bargaining and could go on strike. Somoza continued, number 19. Under a stable government and with dedicated people, Nicaragua prospered. My dream was to make my country a shining example, and here's where he sealed his own doom, a shining example of free enterprise at work. Somoza supported the free enterprise system. He went on, number 20. Nicaragua had thousands of undeveloped acres which were suitable for farming. The land was free. The land was free to the farmers. All they had to do was to clear the land. Notice that under Somoza's government, farmers were given free land to farm. And Somoza taxed idle farmland so that it would be returned to farm use or sold to those who wanted to farm it. A farmer in Nicaragua said this, number 21. Under Somoza, we could grow as much as we liked and get the best price on the free market. At that time, the exchange rate was 7-1, meaning 7's apparently their money to 1 of our money. Now it's officially 760 to 1,200 to 1 on the black market. Someone has been inflating the money supply in Nicaragua. To assist the industrial growth of his nation, Somoza completed arrangements for the nation of Japan to erect 3 geothermal power plants in Nicaragua. It was hoped that with low-cost power, industry would develop in Nicaragua, providing non-farm jobs to its citizens, number 22. The truth is that under Somoza, Nicaragua, and here's the key, Nicaragua was making giant strides into the modern world with a rising standard of living for her people. Nicaragua was developing a middle class. And in every other case where we've seen another nation develop a middle class, it had to go communist. And it did. Yet President Somoza was forced to leave his country on July the 17th, 1979, so that the Sandinista communists could take over. Someone wanted Mr. Somoza out of government. He dared create a middle class. Someone couldn't tolerate the fact that Somoza and Nicaragua was developing a middle class. Let's see if we can figure out who it was that wanted his government to fall. After he left Nicaragua, Somoza wrote this book entitled Nicaragua Betrayed. And there's a picture of Mr. Somoza, and there's the book, As Told to Jack Cox by former President Somoza. We can now determine how Somoza viewed his removal and whether he wanted him to leave Nicaragua. Who wanted him to leave Nicaragua. We're now going to take a look at that and see whether or not Somoza figured it out. Somoza was wise enough to distrust the American government, and he actually tape recorded his conversations with the American ambassadors and representatives after he started to figure this thing out. You can read the word-by-word transcripts of these meetings in his book. Somoza wrote this, number 23. Many crucial conversations were occurring with the U.S. representatives. I decided to do something, tape the conversations. As I said, you can read those just as he wrote them as they were recorded. These are some of Somoza's explanations of what happened before he left Nicaragua, number 24. When the United States assumes leadership in a conspiratorial fashion to annihilate anti-communist nations, I believe it is my duty to speak out. When I have factual evidence that the United States has actually aided and abetted the evil forces of communism, I believe the people of the United States should share in such facts. He continued, number 25. I came to one startling conclusion. Somoza wrote, there is a planned and deliberate conspiracy in the United States of America to destroy that Republican form of government. Number 26, Somoza figured it out. Number 26 again. When I have indisputable knowledge as to the perpetrator of such an insidious betrayal, I feel destined to reveal that identity. And then Mr. Somoza, in his book, identified the betrayer. Somoza charged that it was Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, who betrayed Nicaragua. It was Jimmy Carter that wanted Somoza to leave Nicaragua so that the Sandinista communists could take over. And this is what he said about President Jimmy Carter in his book, number 27. His single-minded and overwhelming purpose had been to put Nicaragua in the hands of the communists. Our nation was truly delivered into the hands of the Marxist enemy by President Jimmy Carter and his administration. That course places Mr. Carter in the company of evil worldwide conspiratorial forces. I repeat, the treacherous course chartered by Mr. Carter was not through ignorance, but by design. He figured it out. Somoza continued with his charges about President Carter, number 28. From now on, every drop of blood that's going to be shed in Nicaragua is going to be the responsibility of the United States. In early 1979, President Carter's administration ended all aid to the Somoza government in Nicaragua. And as I said, Somoza left Nicaragua on July the 17th, 1979. After he left, Congress voted to send $75 million to the Sandinista communist government. And Congress voted down a move to make the aid contingent on a freely held election in Nicaragua. Congress didn't feel it was important for the Sandinistas to hold an election. Don't forget that President Somoza was elected 5 years before Carter wanted him to leave. The new leader of Nicaragua was President Daniel Ortega, number 1. Mr. Ortega has an interesting background. He gave an interview to Playboy magazine in October of 1987. Mr. Ortega is not only the leader of the Nicaraguan government, he is the coordinator of the directorate of the Sandinista Front. The Sandinistas are named after Augusto Cesar Sandino, the Nicaraguan revolutionary who was shot in 1934. Mr. Ortega tells us one important fact about Mr. Sandino. He says this about the revolutionary, number 30. Sandino was a Mason. Sandino was a member of the Masonic Lodge. Notice, Mr. Ortega says that the brutal Sandino was a member of the Masonic Order. Ortega then goes on to say that the Masons have named one of their lodges in Nicaragua the Augusto Cesar Sandino Lodge. Ortega then went on in his Playboy interview. He explained how he got much of his training at that lodge. Ortega says this, number 31. The man who headed the Sandino Masonic Lodge would give us lectures about economic inequalities and politics. That place played an important role in my political development. Many of us went on to become fighters in the Sandinistas. Ortega, whom President Ronald Reagan described as a, quote, dyed-in-the-wool believer in the totalitarian Marxist government, unquote, says that he got his political philosophy from the man who ran the Sandino Masonic Lodge. And Reagan says that politically, Ortega is a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist. Apparently, what he learned at the Masonic Lodge was communism. In August of 1981, the Sandinista defense minister, Humberto Ortega, said this, number 32, Marxism-Leninism is the scientific doctrine that guides our revolution. Without Sandinism, we cannot be Marxist-Leninists. The following oath was published in the pro-Sandinista government newspaper entitled El Nuevo Diario, whatever it is, in 1984. Number 33, I believe in Sandino. I believe in the doctrines and struggles of Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, Nikolai Lenin, and Che Guevara. I believe in the construction of a socialist, Marxist, and Leninist society, unquote. That's what Ortega believes in. Once the Sandinistas took power, they nationalized the banks. Isn't that interesting? This gave them the power to control the money supply. With this control, they could now start the destruction of the middle class by increasing the money supply. In other words, they created inflation. And this they did, as is evidenced by the fact that by 1985, the inflation rate was 300% per year. And also, the Sandinistas started borrowing huge sums so that rapidly their national debt accumulated and was, number 34, $4.5 billion by 1986. One Sandinista even admitted where the money was coming from. He said this, number 35, we, the Sandinista, we, the communists, we, the Nicaraguan government, continue to receive loans from private U.S. banks. Maybe now we're starting to figure out why Nicaragua had to go communist. What type of government have the Sandinistas given the Nicaraguan people? Let's go to number 36. Former Sandinista Jose Francisco Cardinal reports this, number 36, that the communists, Sandinistas, have done more damage in 9 months than Somoza did in 10 years. Something like 12,000 opponents of the regime are still in jail. Every aspect of life in Nicaragua today is being dictated by the communists. Every day the communists seize more property. More than 1 million acres of farmland have already been taken over, and less than 1/5 of the land is now in use. Something's happening in Nicaragua. The result of the communist government is falling production. In every case we've studied where the communists take over, production falls, and it's falling in Nicaragua. Number 37. Cotton production is down 80%. Coffee production is down 30%. Sugar production is down 30%. Meat production is down 40%. Chemicals are down, production is down 40%. Textiles are down 50%. But fortunately, something is up. Something is rising in Nicaragua. Alcohol consumption is up by 30%. When we studied the Russian Revolution, we studied the fact that even today in Russia, alcoholism is a major, major problem. And it appears to be becoming one in Nicaragua. There's no reason to produce in a communist nation. Communism, once again, this time in Nicaragua, proves that communism is an inefficient economic philosophy. It does not work. It never has worked. The only thing keeping communism alive in Nicaragua today are loans from the American bankers. Even William F. Buckley has been quoted as saying that the system has not worked. Here's what Buckley said, number 38. The Nicaraguan people are oppressed at every level. Real wages are down 71% since Somoza was ousted. There are over 4,100 political prisoners. There is no right to strike, no right of assembly, and there is persecution of religion, and there is brutality. An anti-Sandinista writer wrote this in 1986, number 39. A Catholic Church humiliated and silenced, a press debased into an instrument of propaganda, and impoverished people lacking basic necessities while a ruling elite lives in luxury. There's the key. Somebody is prospering in Nicaragua. Neighbor spying on neighbor, jail terms for fabricated infractions, 5,000 political prisoners. Nicaragua is a tragedy that never should have happened. This is Monsignor Carballo, the vicar of the Archdiocese of Managua of the Catholic Church. And here's what he said, number 40. In 1982, our radio broadcasts were censored. In 1983, live Mass on television and radio was prohibited. In 1985, our church bulletin was confiscated. The content changed and then recirculated. In 1986, our radio station was closed. But the so-called popular church, which is completely politicized, is free to utilize all outlets. In this popular church, children are baptized in the name of revolutionary heroes. Our Catholic schools are forbidden to mention religion in the classroom. Apparently, well, let's go now to this November 1985 article in a Nicaraguan newspaper that says that religious persecution occurs in Managua. The article tells us how 5 or 6 pastors were intimidated, kept naked in a freezer room, and photographed by the state security. The state security is the secret police supervised by the East Germans. Now, what keeps the Sandinista government in power? I believe there are 2 things. The first is that the Sandinistas use the threat of America to remind the people that they need to protect the people. They need them, meaning the government, to protect the people from an invasion of America. I have discussed this principle before. It was first brought to my attention when I read this book entitled The Report from Iron Mountain. And there it is, The Report from Iron Mountain on the Possibility and Desirability of Peace. This book was released in 1966 and tells the reader, number 41, the possibility of war provides the sense of external necessity without which no government can long remain in power. The historical record reveals one instance after another where the failure of a regime to maintain the credibility of a war threat led to its dissolution. The organization of a society for the possibility of war is its principal political stabilizer. In other words, if you, the people of Nicaragua, do not support us, the Sandinistas, the dreaded United States is going to come in and do something that you won't like. It's a very common strategy. So the people reluctantly support the Sandinistas. This scenario was discussed by the Arizona Daily Star article on March the 5th, 1986. The headline reads, Sandinistas use fear of U.S. to keep revolution alive. The second thing that is happening, that is keeping the Sandinistas in power, is the threat of a takeover by the Contras. It is my opinion that after trying to figure the Contras out, that the Contras are not, and I repeat, not going to win the Contra-Sandinista war. They're not intended to win, and the Contra leaders, I believe, know that. Let me try to explain why I believe that way. As far as I can determine, the Contras have enough men under arms to win the war, but they haven't. And that is because they are not intended to win the revolution. The Contras could win, but they will not win. The typical American, I'm sure, thinks that the Contras are a guerrilla force that is intent on brutally murdering innocent civilians. The first clue that I had that the Contras would not and did not slaughter innocent civilians came when I watched one of America's leading TV talk programs. The program showed several U.S. congressmen discussing a television report that discussed an alleged Contra shooting of civilians taking a pig to market. The television crew showed the 2 women survivors of the shooting, and they described the attack. They vividly described how their truck was fired on by a group of Contras and that several men with the women were killed. In fact, the 2 women were the only survivors of the attack. After seeing this interview, I asked myself two questions. One, if I was in charge of the Contras, would I want my soldiers, my troops, killing innocent civilians? Of course not. If I was leading a guerrilla war, I would realize that I would need the support of the people, and that I would not allow any of my soldiers to shoot one innocent civilian. If you need the support of the people to keep a guerrilla war alive, you don't shoot civilians. And I would summarily execute any Contra who harmed any civilian. We would need the support of the people, and we wouldn't get it by slaughtering innocent civilians. And the second question that I asked myself was why the Contras left survivors. Why would you leave survivors to tell the press who had done the shooting? That didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me that the Contras would want the people of Nicaragua to know that the Contras were slaughtering innocent civilians. If I was going to shoot innocent civilians and leave survivors, I'd dress my soldiers as Sandinistas, put them in the Sandinista uniform, and then let the survivors know it was the Sandinistas who did the shooting, not the Contras. And then it dawned on me, I believe I figured it out. Who had the most to gain by the people of Nicaragua believing that the Contras shoot innocent civilians? The Sandinistas. Why couldn't the Sandinistas dress up as Contras and then shoot innocent civilians, leave witnesses, and proudly declare that it was the Contras who shot the other people? Notice one more thing. A Nicaraguan dressed in a Contra uniform looks like a Nicaraguan dressed in a Sandinista uniform, except for the clothes. This possibility was discussed in an article that appeared in the Arizona Daily Star on March the 6th, 1986. The article said that President Ronald Reagan charged that the Sandinistas were posing as Contras and then murdering ordinary Nicaraguans. It all made sense to me, especially when I learned that it was the American CIA that gave the uniforms to the Contras. If I was leading a guerrilla war, I would not want my soldiers in uniform. I would want them to be able to blend into the population itself after they had been involved in an attack. Why did the Contras take the uniforms from the CIA? Unless the CIA wanted the Sandinistas to have a uniform to put on so that they could appear to be Contras. They wanted the Sandinistas to put on a uniform so they could appear as Contras. It is the only thing that makes sense. And I knew that I was right because the two congressmen on the television program and the talk show host had not figured it out. I dared to think I had figured it out. Others in Nicaragua dared to think as well. Between 1979, when the Nicaraguan Sandinistas took over, and 1981, about 2 years, over 200,000 Nicaraguans left Nicaragua. They did not like the system. They had discovered the truth of communism. It does not work. What happened to Anastasia Somoza? Sometime around September the 30th, 1980, Somoza's car ran into a stray bazooka shell kind of floating in space, and he was brutally killed. Newsweek magazine of September the 29th, 1980 said that the news of Somoza's assassination caused, number 42, the revolutionary Sandinista government to proclaim a national day of jubilation, unquote. That shows to me how greatly the Sandinistas respect human life. That's disgusting. There is one more thing I'd like to bring to your attention. Both the Newsweek magazine and the Time magazine issues of September the 29th, 1980, had articles on the death of Mr. Somoza. Both Time and Newsweek said that Somoza was, quote, the exiled former dictator of Nicaragua, unquote. A man elected to his nation's highest office by a vote of 9-1 is not a dictator. Somoza was elected, but I guess we're supposed to believe what we read, aren't we? I've never heard of an elected dictator. But if the media says Somoza is a dictator, then Somoza is a dictator. The next thing I'd like to discuss is the crown of St. Stephen. This crown was given to King Stephen of Hungary by Pope Sylvester II in the year 1000 AD for nearly, 1000 AD period. For nearly 1,000 years, this adage has held true. Number 43, he who holds the crown rules Hungary. Let me give you a little history of the crown in the recent past. In 1945, the Russians overran Hungary at the end of the Second World War. Before the communists could seize the Holy Crown, the symbol of the government, it was delivered by its guards to the U.S. Army under the command of General George Patton. This crown was brought to the United States for safekeeping by General Patton until it could be returned to a freely elected Hungarian government. The next step occurred in 1956 with the Hungarian Revolution or uprising, when thousands of Hungarians demanded the withdrawal of Soviet occupation forces. This is a picture of the head from a statue of the Russian dictator Joseph Stalin that had been destroyed by the freedom fighters during that uprising. The Soviets moved tanks into the cities in revolt, and the revolution was put down. One of the reasons that freedom fighters were unsuccessful was because they had no way to resist. They fought tanks with sticks and stones, but they loved their freedom. And they were temporarily successful. A government led by Imre Nagy actually was established when the communist Russians left, and they were in power for 5 days. The Russian tanks withdrew. But the new government needed Western assistance to survive. The freedom fighters got control of a radio station on November the 4th, 1956. The freedom fighters asked for assistance from the rest of the world. Number 44. This is what they broadcast over Hungary and was picked up in Europe. Number 44. People of the world, help us, not with words, but with action. People of the civilized world, in the name of liberty and solidarity, we are asking you to help. The light vanishes. The shadows grow darker hour by hour. Listen to our cry. Start moving. Extend to us your brotherly hands. God be with you and with us. But America and the rest of the so-called free world did nothing. John Stormer, the author of this little book, entitled None Dare Call It Treason, which sold millions of copies back in the early 60s, talked about America's lack of interest in the Hungarian Revolution. This is what he said, number 45. Is it possible that President Dwight Eisenhower, the President of the United States at the time of the Hungarian uprising, and his State Department didn't know what they were doing? In other words, we didn't help. According to Stormer, they did know. They meant for the Hungarian revolt to fail. Mr. Stormer then went on to explain that in 1960, an American congressman released the text of a State Department cablegram to Marshal Tito, the head of the neighboring communist government of Yugoslavia. The cable had been sent during the middle of the Hungarian uprising. The cable read, number 46, the government of the United States does not look with favor upon governments unfriendly to the Soviet Union on the borders of the Soviet Union. In other words, we did not want Hungary to go anti-communist. Just 36 hours after the Tito received the cablegram, the Soviet tanks reinvaded Hungary and crushed the revolt. 3 years later, Nikita Khrushchev, the dictator of Russia, admitted that he would have abandoned Hungary if the United States had recognized the new government. He would not have sent the troops and the tanks back into Hungary had America simply recognized the new government of the anti-communist freedom fighters. But America did nothing. So Russia continued to occupy Hungary. Mr. Stormer explained what message our inaction sent to the rest of the free world. Number 47. Our staunchest allies, the enslaved people behind the Iron Curtain, now believe that they cannot expect help from America. The crown of St. Stephen still stayed in America. Cardinal Minzeni, the strongly anti-communist primate of Hungary, did not want the crown to return to his native Hungary. Number 48. Friends of the cardinal say that he still looks forward to the day when the communist tyranny, which has slowly squeezed human rights out of Hungary, will collapse. He believes that then, and only then, should the historic crown be returned. However, in 1972, plans were being made to return the crown, and they did. Some continued to resist. 25 congressmen proposed a resolution for Congress that would keep the crown in the United States until Hungary once again functioned as a, quote, constitutional government established by the Hungarian people through choice, unquote. In 1974, Cardinal Minzeni was asked this question: did he or the Hungarian people harbor any resentment against the United States because it failed to act in 1956? The Cardinal said this, according to the San Jose Mercury, number 49. The late President, meaning Eisenhower, was responsible. President Eisenhower was responsible for the defeat of the Hungarian freedom fighters and their revolution in 1956. You might remember in our discussion of the Trial Commission a few weeks ago, I told you how David Rockefeller, the wealthy American banker and not a Catholic, had met with Pope Paul VI, the head of the Catholic Church in Rome, in January of 1974. I then discussed how the Pope, in February of 1974, ordered Cardinal Minzeni of Hungary to come to Rome. The Pope told him that he could no longer speak out about the evils of communism. Cardinal Minzeni was officially silenced. The most visible and the most powerful obstacle in the way of the return of the crown to Hungary was now out of the way. Cardinal Minzeni could no longer speak out against the return of the crown to the communist government in Hungary. He had been silenced by the Pope. And in April of 1977, the United States and Communist Hungary signed an agreement to turn over the crown to the communist government. Number 43, he who holds the crown rules Hungary. Our government was officially recognizing the communist government of Hungary. He who holds the crown rules Hungary. We were telling any remaining anti-communist resistance in Hungary that the battle was over. There was no further reason to resist. The crown of St. Stephen had been turned over to the communists in Hungary. Remember, he who holds the crown rules Hungary. President Jimmy Carter personally made the decision to turn the crown over to the Communist government of Hungary. And Jimmy Carter, Trilateral Commission member, physically turned the crown over to Hungary at the end of his trip to Europe from November the 22nd to December the 2nd, 1977. A congressman opposed to the return of the crown said this, number 50. The return of the Holy Crown would be a symbol that the United States believes communist rule will go on indefinitely in Hungary and the other Eastern European nations. And President Carter returned the crown. Just one more example of how the American government has been telling the world that it is not opposed to communism. If I am right that the election of 1976 was to elect Jimmy Carter, the election of 1980 was to remove him from office and elect Ronald Reagan. That possibility was explored in this cartoon that appeared in 1979. It shows Jimmy Carter seated at his desk saying, first, the Shah should step down, and he did that as we just discussed. Then he said Ian Smith of Rhodesia should step down, and Ian Smith did step down. Then Carter says Somoza of Nicaragua should step down, and Somoza did step down. And then in the last picture, we see Jimmy Carter in front of a big exit sign and descending stairs saying, "Have I left out anybody?" I believe he did. Carter had to exit as well. If the Trial Commission wanted Jimmy Carter elected in 1976, why would the Trial Commission want him out of office in 1980? I believe the answer to that question is because the Trial Commission wanted Ronald Reagan in office in 1980. Let me try to prove that in as much time as we have remaining. Let me start by refreshing your memory. Jimmy Carter ran for the presidency in 1976 with the full support of the Trial Commission. In fact, a couple of weeks ago we talked about that, and we talked about how the Trial Commission actually discovered Jimmy Carter and made him president. Jimmy Carter was seeking re-election in 1980, but the Trial Commission was no longer supporting him. Now, how do you defeat an incumbent president seeking re-election? By dividing his vote. You run a fellow Trial Commission member against him to siphon off his votes. And they did this by running John Anderson against Jimmy Carter. Congressman Anderson was a member of the Trial Commission when he ran against Jimmy Carter. According to an article that appeared in the August 1st, 1980 Arizona Daily Star, Congressman Anderson admitted that his purpose in running was to make certain that President Carter would not be reelected. The article read thusly, Anderson might quit if Carter is dumped. The article said that Congressman Anderson would consider dropping his independent candidacy if President Carter did not win the Democratic presidential nomination. As you remember, Carter did win the nomination, and his fellow Trial Commission member, Congressman John Anderson, ran against him. If the Trial Commission wanted Jimmy Carter to be reelected, why didn't they persuade Congressman Anderson not to run? You would think that Anderson and Carter shared the same goals, and that Anderson would want Carter to be reelected, and that the conservative Reagan would be their common enemy. But Reagan was not Anderson's enemy. Jimmy Carter was. By the way, it is very interesting that